The Belong Online Literature Festival, or BOLF. I know my colleagues have been calling it BOLF. It just hasn't caught on with me in the same way. So the BOLF is an initiative of Belong, a social venture that seeks to bring discrimination-free services and experiences to people who face identity-based discrimination. We run programs for inclusive housing, inclusive mental health, inclusive research, as well as a book club and library for inclusive literatures. You can learn more about these on www.belong.net. Before we begin, we want to acknowledge the tireless efforts of our festival partners, our media partner, The Wire, our cultural partner, the British Council, and our accessibility partner, Access for All, without whom this event would not be possible. Now, on to today's session. This session is Righting Wrongs, Sexual Rights and Freedom in India with Parmesh Shahani, Saurabh Kirpal, and Madhavi Menon. The session will be moderated by Anish Gawande. Anish is a writer and translator. He is the director of the Dara Shikoh Fellowship and curator of Pink List India. Anish graduated with a degree in comparative literature and society from Columbia University and is currently pursuing a degree in intellectual history at Oxford University.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And I want to get into this right away because we seem to have very little time and we have three incredible people with us today discussing very important issues. So I'm going to do quick introductions of our phenomenal panelists for the day today, starting with Madhavi Menon. I'm going to read this off, so pardon me for that. Madhavi Menon is a professor of English and director of the Center for Studies in Gender at Ashoka University. She writes on desire and queer theory. She is the author of Wanted Words, Rhetoric and Sexuality in English Renaissance Drama, on historical Shakespeare, queer theory in Shakespearean literature and film, and Indifference to Difference on queer universalism. She is also the editor of Shakespeare, a queer companion to the complete works of Shakespeare. Her latest book, Infinite Variety, A History of Desire in India, examines the many faces of desire in India, from numbers to grammar, army barracks to public parks, erotic sculptures to religious shrines. Very happy to have you here today, Madhavi. And then we have Saurabh Kirpal, who after studying physics at St. Stephen's College in Delhi, read law at the University of Oxford and did his master's in law at the University of Cambridge. He did a brief stint working with the UN in Geneva before returning to Delhi, where he has been practicing at the Supreme Court for well over 2 decades. He has appeared in a range of matters involving fundamental rights and was the counsel for Navtej Zohar, Ritu Dalmia, and others in the case that led to the reading down of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code. A self-described accidental activist, he is also a trustee of the Naz Foundation Trust. Saurabh is also the author of the forthcoming book, Sex and the Supreme Court, an anthology about legal issues relating to gender and sexuality. Very glad to have you as well, Saurabh. And last, but obviously not the least, somebody I have worked with in the past and who is a superstar as well, Parmesh Shahani, who is Vice President of Godrej Industries and the founder of the award-winning Godrej India Culture Lab, which sparks conversations and collaborations about the changing face of contemporary India. He's a passionate advocate for LGBTQI+ inclusion in corporate India and has guided many of the country's leading companies on their inclusion journeys. His first book, K. Bombay, Globalization, Love and Belonging in Contemporary India, released in 2008 and re-released this year in 2020 as an updated edition. His second book, Queeristan, LGBTQI+ Inclusion in the Indian Workplace, will be released in September 2020. Parmesh holds an MS in Comparative Media Studies from MIT. He's been a TED Senior Fellow, a Yale World Fellow, and a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. He's a member of the FICCI Task Force on Diversity and Inclusion and a board member of Coach International Artists Association. These are very impressive bios indeed, and it is an incredible pleasure to be with all of these people here today and here discussing something very important. I think the title of this panel is Righting Wrongs and How We Move Forward in the Fight for LGBTQI+ rights in India. And I want to begin with a sort of more important question about the very fact that we've come to a stage where we have started to treat LGBTQI+ rights as human rights, right? And this is something that I want Madhavi to shed a little light on, that today we treat LGBTQI+ rights within a human rights framework. We're treating them as sort of fundamental rights. We're approaching them through a rights-based methodology. This is one that has been critiqued in the past for being limited. What is this? How has this rights-based methodology allowed the queer movement to find a voice? And who does it leave behind and what does it leave behind?
Thank you, Anish. Thanks for the very generous introductions. You made us all sound much more accomplished than we actually are, I think. And thanks also to Manjari and Belong. This is a wonderful Lit Fest. Congratulations to all of you. I'm sure both Saurabh and Parmesh could address this question much more sort of knowledgeably than I can, Anish, but I'll give it a stab and they can jump in, I'm sure. I'm not a big fan of rights-based discourses for some of the reasons that you alluded to towards the end of your question. And so in many ways, I'm sort of going to be setting aside the earlier part of your question about what it means to include LGBTQIA plus rights as human rights. Because the trouble and let me just sort of make clear that I think rights as a protection from or against violence, against sort of the disintegration of body and mind and emotion and desire is absolutely vital, and we all need to be protected. We all need that protection, and there is absolutely no gainsaying that. So my criticism of rights-based discourse is not because I think some people need rights and other people don't. I think everyone needs to be protected against violences of all kinds, and I'd like to make that very clear. The trouble for me with rights-based discourse is in fact the dilemma that it does not include everybody. And so every time you have a right for some people, it always has to be by definition to the exclusion of other people. So you can only have a right for a group if you say, we're not actually talking about people who are not part of this group. And so even with the reading down of 377, as you all know, it's sort of read it down by saying we will give the right to consensual sex in private to same-sex consenting adults, but we're not going to read down the other parts of 377. And there are very good reasons not to read down the other parts of 377 about bestiality and sex sort of with underage children. I'm not saying that's good or bad. All I'm saying is that whenever you have a right by definition, you have to have an exclusion. And so for me, our investment in rights-based discourse has become so absolute that we've simply stopped thinking about what alternatives there might be. And so my interest really is in thinking about if we are committed, as all of us are certainly here today, to a world in which violence of any kind is not legally permitted or permissible upon anybody, then are rights the best way to go about doing that? Or can we have something like, and Saurabh will know much more about this than me, can we have something like non-discrimination clauses that apply to everybody, everywhere, which would not be a rights-based discourse and therefore would not necessarily need to define an out-group in order to consolidate an image?
That's incredibly, I think that's a powerful way to frame that. And I think it sets the stage also for the conversation that we'll continue to have. But before we jump a little forward, Saurabh, I wanted to bring you in here a little bit, because as somebody who's been involved with the verdict, as somebody who's seen the sort of transition of the Indian judiciary's approach towards sexuality from 2009 to 13 to 18, in the current framework that we have, what is the sort of process that the judiciary has used? What is the process the judiciary has used to endow rights or to affirm the rights of the queer community? Because we all know that they read down 377, but what is the sort of legal juggling that went on behind it and the sort of framing of this?
Well, you see, I come from a more dry arena than possibly Madhavi, so I'm constrained by the language of the law. And the way the language of the law is inevitably framed is in this kind of a dialectic of rights and duties, right? It's correct in some level to say that conferring a right to one particular community or group, you automatically exclude those who you're not giving rights to. But unfortunately, for the law, there is no other way of functioning other than through the endowment of rights. And these rights weren't endowed by the courts. The rights have been endowed to us in 1950 by the Constitution of India. I'm not talking of the colonial era and the period prior to 1950, because really there were no substantive guaranteed rights akin to natural rights as now contained in our Constitution. There were rights, yes, the British knew the concept of rights. It's not as though we were living in a completely lawless society. But I think these rights were a product of the time we were living in, the product of the freedom struggle. They came in 1950. So the rights that are being employed now, the tools that are being employed now by the courts have been employed for the last 70 years, right? They haven't changed. The language of the rights has changed a bit through various constitutional amendments, but they haven't changed substantially. I think what's changed is how the courts bring themselves to view what is the content of the rights. Right? When a constitution says that all people are equal before law, now that's a very dry phraseology which could mean anything. Equal means what, to whom, who determines it, etc. So society has changed. The consideration of what a judge feels society is, ought to be, and what the constitution is and ought to be. They gave a process of interpretation, I think. And that's what is important to understand, that really the substance of the right, which has been endowed by the constitution, is fleshed out by individuals who are reading a text at any point of time, affected, of course, as they are by their own sociological upbringing, by the economic, political status. Judges are not people in ivory towers, they are products of society they live in. So the language and the tech tools that they've used, Anish, is a rights-based discourse. And frankly, in law, there can be nothing else because I find it difficult to envisage some other tool that would allow people to get their rights other than rights. It would be too cumbersome. I think the idea of a right, the way it exists in law, is not the fact that there is a person with a right and a person excluded from the right. I think the proper way to consider in law is there is a person with a right and a person with a corresponding obligation or a duty to enforce that right, or to make sure that the right is not trampled upon. So I would say, look at the right to non-discrimination, as Madhavi said. The corresponding obligation is on employers to ensure that there is no non-discrimination. So that's what
I actually want to take this one step further, and I think that the way you framed it is very powerful, into a sort of excavation of where this rights-based discourse began, right? And I think the locus of that rights-based discourse, which is a process of excavating queer history, is often an important one. That who has been fighting for these rights and where have these rights aligned themselves? I think a large conversation that often happens is that the rights-based discourse is something that began in the 1990s, etc. But very recently, I was in conversation with Disha Pinky Sheikh, who is the first trans woman to be the spokesperson for a political party in Maharashtra. She's also a Dalit Ambedkarite poet and writer, who said that it was in fact in 1930 that Ambedkar had defended a newspaper editor who dared to publish a letter from a gay man saying that he was gay, and replied in the affirmative saying there's nothing wrong with you. Under public decency laws, the same that are used to round up couples on Marine Drive in Bombay today, this man was taken to court, and Ambedkar was one of the few people who defended him, right? Later on, you see someone like Namdev Dhasal, who before the sort of AIDS movement and ABVA and a lot of other organizations, leads a morcha in Maharashtra for trans women and for sex workers to get ration cards. And I think there's been in the past few years, a sort of reframing of this rights-based approach as one that doesn't necessarily only involve right to sexuality, but also a broader encompassing of multiple variables. And I want to go to Parmesh here because, Parmesh, you've actually been the locus of facilitating many such conversations. You had caste and queerness as a panel at the lab. You've pushed the boundaries of what it means to be queer at a time when sort of the language around sexuality was still finding its footing. How do you think that queer rights exist with other rights, and the boxes that we often place them within?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to build off something Saurabh said, where Saurabh spoke about obligations, right? And I think that's so important because whether we use right-based or alternative approaches, I'm personally very much interested in how these laws are being translated, how they are being used. What changes come about, how do all our queer siblings have better lives, right? Because otherwise, see, the 377 judgment has to translate into, better lives for queer citizens all over. Otherwise, it exists, only on paper. Likewise, if the Nalsa judgment of 2014, could not translate into a good trans act, what was the point of that progressive Nalsa judgment? And if Grace Banu still has to petition for art and, do RTIs every time, either to get herself into college or to get other, trans people into college, then what is the point? So, so I think whatever approach we use, it's really, I think, within the queer movement, time has really been passing us by. 7 decades have passed us by, and we, I really want to see action on the ground. But just, also, when you started by marking these moments of 2009, 2013, 2018, and I think how the stories that we tell ourselves also about these moments are also key, right? How do we tell our histories, legal histories or otherwise, right? Whose histories do we tell? In Queeristan, my book, I talk about visiting Kamra, the new archive in Bangalore, which is coming up, which is the queer archive, and how they have so much oral histories from lawyers and petitioners from 2013, and who lost. And, not just people who argued in courts, but people who worked at NGOs, parents, and so on, right? It would be really interesting to look at some of the arguments that were left on the side because people at a particular time thought that let's go with this approach. What if we might have gone with another approach, right? I mean, so I think, when we historicize, it's really nice to not just historicize the victors. It would be really nice to look at all the different perspectives. But, to talk about what you asked me, I think more and more fundamentally what we've realized at the Culture Lab is that, we really have to look at things through multiple vantage points. And, everything has to be through the framework of intersectionality and solidarity, right? So we don't just look at queerness, for example, when we have Pride Month, because June is not Pride Month in India. Every city has its own pride. So we have Pride Year, actually. And we don't look at it only in the sense of queerness. So we'll do a migration museum. We will look at what does it mean to be, for queerness to intersect with migration, right? We'll do something else. We'll do a panel on, say, women in STEM. And there will be either queer people or queer experiences in that as well, right? And so on and so forth. And I think what's interesting about the world right now, in the kind of world, and you are very much part of this world, right? Which is coming up with what you're doing with Pink List on one side, Dara Shiko on the other, Powerloom workers' rights in Bhiwandi on the third, right? You through your own practice are showing us how you can look, how, workers' rights are linked to the rights of, say, of students from all over the country, right? That are linked to, I mean, LGBT rights can be about COVID relief, but also about politics, by talking about Disha, Pinky, Sheikh, and other, right? So I think the future is, to borrow a term from Madhavi, about an infinite variety of resistances that we all are going to have to practice. And to me, these resistances will come about when we build loose alliances between all our different, objectives and social movements, based sometimes on convenience, sometimes strategically, always, I hope, on empathy. And also when we actually infiltrate the mainstream in multiple ways and open up possibilities of action. So, I mean, I have a lot more to say, but I really want to hear what Madhavi and Saurabh have to say as well. So,
Madhavi and Saurabh, please feel free to chip in over here, because I think a lot of discussions have been opened up. So if you feel the need to say anything, and just before you say something.
I mean, this is wonderful. A word that Parmesh used that sort of warms the cockles of my heart all the time is solidarities, coalitions. And I'm a big believer in solidarities, because which also sort of informs my critique of rights, because I really believe we need to be able to build strengths across rather than entrench within. And I think unless we build strengths across, not only can we reach out to people, but people won't reach out to us either. And we need to be very aware of that. I just want to say, something by way of a funny anecdote. when Parmesh ended by saying, you know, we need to infiltrate the mainstream, I was reminded of something that Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, a queer theorist, once said. And she said she was once asked by a deeply homophobic person who was sort of trying to dismiss all work in queer theory. And this person asked her, well, has there ever been a gay Plato? Has there ever been a gay Shakespeare? And she says, yes, there have been, and their names are Plato and Shakespeare. And so this idea of who is in the mainstream and who is not is actually a question, because we are in the mainstream, and you know, and people don't even know it. And so there is a way in which I like that friction. I mean, I like that idea of being visible and invisible at once, because I think there is a lot of strength in shadow play, which I would be sad if we were to lose.
Just Bombay, I think Delhi is, which is pretty bad for the internet. I've just run up this. I've actually got 4 different internet connections during this lockdown.
Oh,
You
wow.
just wanted to show us your other art piece.
Yes.
Which
Come home one day.
is gorgeous.
Manisha Tiwari.
We've got can we get a tour of the house? I think this is now, we must all now open this up.
We've
Queering
reached
space.
that time.
We're going from writing wrong to queering space. It's an equally attractive title. So I just want to pivot very quickly over here and build upon sort of a quick thing that we were just discussing, is sort of frameworks of intersectionality that Madhavi and Parmesh touched upon. I want to build a little bit upon that through a lot of the work that I've been doing both academically and otherwise, which is how we framed sort of queer resistance, right? I think so far queer resistance has been framed in an anti-colonial lens, right? Which means that we've said that the Victorian morality is what got us 377. Victorian morality is the reason behind the sort of homophobia and transphobia that exists around us. And we've thrown open the doors to a sort of revivalist project that borders very dangerously on this Make America Great Again, Make India Great Again project, while in the garb of decolonization. And it's a project that sometimes has detached the queer movement from other struggles, such as the feminist struggle, such as the sort of the caste struggle, anti-caste struggle, labor struggles, and movements for things like autonomy in Kashmir. And it's a struggle that I wouldn't say did not exist in the queer community. One of the earliest slogans at Pride used to be "Kaun sa kanun sabse badtar, afspa sedition 377." So that sort of slogan itself was a reminder of what queerness meant. But both through the legal process and through our understandings of queerness as a shedding of Victorian morality, we've somehow assumed that queerness is not political. And this is a debate that comes up always, that, you know, keep LGBTQI plus rights separate, keep everything else separate. How do we tackle that? And Saurabh, feel free to chime in, because I think, you know, this is something that the legal argument in court was also very powerfully focused on, not just because of itself, but also because of around the media coverage around it. How do we go and challenge that notion that it's just an anti-colonial fight?
I think there's a problem with ghettoization of any particular right? To say that it is about LGBT rights and therefore everything else is automatically excluded, I think that's an error, which is both tactical as well as practical. And if you fight a matter in court, we'll come to that later. But just as a point of building a community, I think it's silly to just say that we, the LGBTQI community, are an independent lot and we will not interact with anybody else, for the simple reason that you won't get the numbers, really. Forget the reason as to why you should do it for a greater good, etc. Just as a purely practical point of view, it makes sense to find allies and work together with other communities which are disadvantaged or oppressed or marginalized. So this is just a very practical thing that one ought to do, right? So that's the practical aspect of it, so to say, the teleological aspect. There is also the ontological aspect, which is, it is good in itself as a person who is marginalized to feel an empathy for other marginalized communities and then to form alliances for that purpose alone, for the sheer good of it, right? But I think one important aspect is that every experience is different, right? And while there is a commonality of oppression and marginalization in both LGBT community as well as the feminist, caste, or various other movements, I think when a matter goes to court, inevitably the questions become more limited, right? And the reason is that a court of law is a very different place than society and parliament. The mandate of a judge is through the means of the fact that they are unelected and they interpret in the constitution, it's a bit more limited. So inevitably, when they have a case before them, they are supposed to look at the facts of that particular case. And in that moment, to bring in the struggles of other communities or classes is a bit difficult. Also practically difficult because judges will just get confused as to how you're doing this. That doesn't mean that we don't use the language of other communities in the matter that is applied to the case at hand. So to take the 377 judgment, well, ostensibly it's all about the LGBTQIA movement. It's explicitly so. But when you read the judgments, I think you'd find in the language of human rights, in the language of equality, in the language of what it means to be a person, to be a citizen, you'll find commonalities of what it means to be a person holding constitutional rights under our constitution, which is common then, not only for the LGBT community, but also for every other class of oppressed people who will take these legal tools, who will use the 377 judgment and say, now take my case, extend it, right? So the point is, you have the tool, which is common, but that extension process must happen on a case-by-case basis for each community. And I think it's important, therefore, to understand what are the commonalities of it, but to simply brush aside the fact that there are differences, I think would be an error as well.
If anyone else wants to chime in, I quickly want to say, I just want to add one term to the discussion. This is very intriguing because I think it mirrors, and she might hate me for saying this, but a little bit of strategic essentialism, you know, to use Spivak's terminology, that a community sort of uses strategic essentialism to demand for its rights, with the accompanying danger that that strategic essentialism ends up becoming essentialism. But
I'll just interject there, and that's true. Look, any legal strategy in court is a risk, right? I think no one goes into a court of law knowing for certain as to what the outcome will be. We took a risk when we filed the matter in 2016, which led to the Navtej Johar judgment. But I think that's a calculated risk that we have to take. And that is another reason why sometimes in court it's important to limit your appeal, because you know you'll get that little bit. But if you pitch your case too high, you may not get it. So practically, that's another reason sometimes why you have to, even though you don't wish to, you have to pull yourself back slightly from pushing the rights of everybody. Sorry, Madhavi, you're saying.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, this is why one needs people doing different things in different spheres of life, right? So I can completely sympathize sort of with what you said about the need to be practical in a court of law, even though your sort of implied assumption about what this says about the ability of judges to take on board complex issues, I will set that aside for now. But I just want to say, for instance, and I've talked about this before, I've talked about this with you earlier. Remember one of the most egregious, offensive, horrible moments of the 2013 hearing was when a sitting Supreme Court judge in open court says, I do not know a single gay person. Do you? And he asks the lawyer, who then laughs and says, oh, I'm not so new fashioned, or, you know, I'm old fashioned, or whatever stupid response came. And I just find that moment so horrifying, and that it was allowed to stand and that there was absolutely no backlash against it. So for me, and this is why I guess I'm not a lawyer, but for me, fighting that moment, that everything surrounding that moment, the circumstances that allowed this man to say what he did in open court, is much more important. Not more important than winning 2018. Of course, that's important too. But I think we have to be able to say, and this goes back to the conversation earlier that Parmesh and I were having, which is that what would it mean if he were to say, do you know a single gay person? For everybody in that courtroom to have stood up and said, all of us have carnal acts against the law of nature. All of us perform carnal acts against the law of nature. It's narrowly sticking to the letter of the law. Even he should have understood that. But it's actually widening the scope and opening the horizons of possibilities for the kinds of solidarities we've been talking about, right? So I'm just sort of saying, I'm not necessarily, because I'm not a lawyer, I don't know how that would have translated. But for me, from my vantage point as a queer theorist, to me, that would have sort of addressed the issue and actually opened up the conversation rather than shutting it down. And I mean, I let Parmesh say something, but Anish, I'll come back to your post-colonial question at some point later on.
Yeah, this is also why, and you know, Anish, you know the different kinds of work that we've been doing, right? This is also why we do that kind of work. This is why Queeristan is coming about, right? Set very much in corporate India, addressed very much in mainstreaming, and just so that in any future courtroom when these questions are asked, it is very normal for people to stand up and say, yeah, my nephew, my child, my sibling, my friend, I know many queer people. And one of the ways in which change comes about is through the laws, and we really, really need that. We need laws and we need ways, and we then need the translation of the law towards implementation. But another way, and this goes back to what Saurabh was talking about, the fact that in these theatrical courts, there are judges, and judges are influenced by what they see, what they read, what they hear, what they experience. And the judgment doesn't come out of thin air. So how do we create situations all around us, whether it's in media, whether it's in colleges, whether it's in workplaces, where, you know, you hear so many stories of positivity, hope, resilience, acceptance and inclusion that, you know, this horrific moment of 2013, which is laughter and derision for queer people, doesn't happen. And, you know, and for me, I completely empathize with you, Saurabh, because, you know, just like, you know, courts have very limited spaces which you can argue, you know, companies, corporate boardrooms are perhaps even more so. So strategic essentialism for some of us, at least for me, it's not something that I do willingly or enthusiastically. I do it because I often have no choice, and I'm impatient and I want to get things done. So yeah.
Yeah, no, the luxuries of academia are many, and I revel in them. Absolutely.
Okay, I'm going to field one final question before we move on to the audience, because I realize we only have around 25 minutes left. Is that how do we move forward through an approach that sort of has a rights-based approach but goes beyond? And what I mean by this is that so far we've had to depend on the courts for rights. How do we move towards a space where queerness becomes, oh, we have till 4:30. Okay, so we have a lot of time. I'm fine. Okay, so how do we move beyond and exist alongside rights-based approaches with an approach that says queerness becomes a political entity in and of itself that can demand for rights and outside the frameworks of the courtroom? And so far we've seen this happen with the trans community because they are better organized. The Gharana system allows for a certain sort of mobilization. How do we use, and this is something I think is a concept I want to expand upon, how do we use queerness as translation? How do we embody the fact that queer Dalits exist, queer Adivasis exist, queer Muslims exist, queer Kashmiris exist, and use queerness as a sort of narrative to weave these struggles together in a way that makes assertion of demands both more serious and more provocative, and therefore taken more seriously?
I think there's just one issue I have with a discussion which is framed in this manner, which is to say, how can we bring queer Dalits, queer Muslims, etc. together? The problem with the community so far, the LGBT community, I think is not one of only not recognizing the differences between different communities. I think the fact is we don't recognize our commonality, right? So before we say that, how do we bring in the queer Dalit as well? How do we bring in the queer Muslim as well? I think we have to identify first as queer. Now, this is not to say that there are no differences. I think we all recognize that. But sometimes I think we beat ourselves so much about making sure that we appreciate all the differences that we forget to see that unless we organize ourselves on a unifying principle of queerness first, address the issues of differences within the queer community on another level, but don't let that always come to the fore, because I find that happening increasingly in discussions. It's, I suppose, in form of, I suppose, like this discussion we're having. But if we want to make a change politically, we need the numbers, right? And the numbers will come not only by splintering ourselves into smaller and smaller, ever smaller groups. We'll need to bring commonalities in everything. And so therefore I wouldn't say look at queer Dalit, queer Muslim, queer, I would say look at queers, look at women, look at all Dalits, look at all Muslims. So the various oppressed minorities towards the queer community will have to be mobilized simultaneously. As regards a political movement, I can't imagine it being easy to mobilize politically in a sense that we'd make an electoral difference, right? It's simply not going to happen because we live in a country where people are afraid to come out. So it's not going to be easy to make an electoral difference. I think we need to be out there to be visible to core communities and to audiences which matter. I think the role that we as lawyers play will work out in judges. There are people like Parmesh who are in the corporate world. They will stand up and speak to the community that counts there. So I think once, and Madhavi in the academic circles, which is already a battle half won, I'm sure. So till we find 4 or 5 of these areas where queer voices will be magnified beyond their punching power, right? And then use that as a way of changing opinions and laws without recourse to electoral arithmetic, I can't see hope unless you have the rights-based approach.
Anish, can I build on that for a bit? And Madhavi, is that okay? Yeah. And this is also answering a bunch of questions, because so many of the questions are saying, what can we do? What can we do? How can we be part of this, right? So I think it's allyship, and what Saurabh is essentially talking about is allyship. So building on what Saurabh said is, how can we be better allies to each other, and how can we be better allies with other things? And I think there's, I mean, if you're watching and you want to know what we can do, if you are not queer, how do you support queer people or the queer community at large? You show up for us. First you stand up for us. You stand up for our rights. When you feel that they are being trampled or taken away from us, etc. And if you are in a majority, then I would even argue that you're obligated to stand up for our rights, because as any majority, it's you want to make any minority feel comfortable, welcome, etc. Right? You stand up for our rights. You show up for us when we need you to, and you speak up. So I think everything that you were talking about, right? And the same, I think, principle should apply even within the queer community. Who do we stand up for? Who do we show up for? And who do we speak up for? And I think here, I would say that we maybe need to do a little soul searching. Saurabh, I think, at this, I think it's a crucial moment, and I think it would help us in the queer community if we look at some of the concerns, right? And a lot of the concerns, say right now, especially among, say, our trans siblings, are that so many trans people have always stood up, and this is not just in India, I think this is even, globally, for whether in the US marriage equality or here for 377, but not enough of the other range of queer people, whether lesbian, gay, etc., are standing up against the Trans Act. So within the queer community and outside as well, right? So I would think if there is resentment, I think it is on, the onus is on all of us within the queer community as well as allies outside the queer community to really show up, stand up and speak up, saying that this Trans Act needs to be modified and we need a better version of the Trans Act, right? I think that another more fundamental way, if anyone can, and again, I'm just looking at some of the questions saying where will change come from? What I've realized is that a great place for change to come from is in the workplace, because everyone, we are either self-employed or we are working somewhere, or someone is giving us a job or whatever, right? Or we're giving people jobs, right? So if you really want to contribute anywhere, whether you're queer or not queer, hire a queer person, or if you are a queer person, figure out how you are going to, in some way or the other, make that part of the conversation, because often then that is kind of an inroad into having these conversations, because then people go home and have the conversation saying, we have a new colleague today, she happens to be lesbian, and then, their families, the minds change, and then, like, and so on. And that's also how change spreads as well. But I would say, show up, speak up, and hire queer people would be a really, really good way of making this change happen. I know Madhavi wanted to say something else.
And again, I'm sort of addressing, multiple things that people have said, including you, Anish. You see, the dilemma with which queerness presents us is that if we think about queerness as a resistance, as a form of resistance, as a form of resistance to normativity, as a form of resistance to majoritarianism, then to use queerness to come up with a new norm actually defeats the purpose of queerness itself. And so to think about queerness as resistance is also very difficult process for many of us, but is also to take on board the certainty that queerness cannot give us a new truth onto which we can latch. What that means is that if we are taking queerness seriously, and I know we all do in different ways, but that if we are to take queerness seriously as a position of resistance, as a position that stands outside to the extent that an outside is possible, then we also have to acknowledge the fact that we are all there combined on the outside, and that we're never ever going to be able to posit an inside, if by the inside we consider a normative way of being in the world. So this, of course, will address both what Saurabh and Parmesh were saying, and Saurabh was sort of, I think, quite rightly expressing frustration with the sort of splintering of marginalities or the splintering of resistances. Now, if we recognize queerness as naming all those resistances, that is a position to occupy which is actually not a single position. It is not a position that a person can occupy or that an idea can occupy. It is a position of resistance itself. And so the idea of queerness then does not become an embodied, localized, practical or practiced or experiential idea in the sense of, is what I do queer bodily or emotionally or politically? It always becomes, do I stand up, to use Parmesh's term, and say no to whatever it is that might actually be trampling non-violence, for lack of a better term, in the world? Do I stand up and say no? Do I stand up and resist anything, any normativity? And by that, I mean even the normativities to which queerness might be attracted. Do I stand up against all normativities to say, I am the anti-norm, I am going to protest? And for me, this is why the anti-CAA protests, especially in Shaheen Bagh, which for me was the only calm place in all of Delhi, was because they were just sitting there protesting, period. There was poetry, there was literature, there was song, there was dance, there was reading, there was education, but there was no saying, give me my right. The protest was, I say no. And I think that needs to be understood as the negativity that queerness brings to the table. Now, it is very tempting for many of us, and as both Parmesh and Saurabh have said, it might often be strategically important to convert that negativity into a positive or into a norm. For me, though, I remain very, very attached to that art and the act and the politics of saying no.
Thank you so much for that. I want to end on a very short note before we take questions that, like Shaheen Bagh, right? And Shaheen Bagh actually had an entire evening where queer and trans people were invited to address Shaheen Bagh. Mumbai Pride happened when Mumbai Bagh was still operational. And I remember going to Mumbai Pride in a no CA, no NRC t-shirt and with a rainbow jhola and my sort of placard, and then going to Mumbai Bagh right after. And a lot of people greeting me Happy Pride in what one would traditionally consider to be a regressive homophobic space, right? This is like one of the densest Muslim populated pockets of Bombay. This is Madhavi. This is where you would expect the greatest amount of resistance. And Saurabh, I completely agree with you. And I didn't mean centering of marginalities. What I think is, again, this form of solidarity. And something that I've noticed is that in my own work, for the longest time, I was terrified of coming out because I worked in Kashmir. I thought that it would be absolutely impossible to do any work in Kashmir if I was an out gay man. I was not going to go to Srinagar and be in those sort of forward-facing roles. But after I eventually came out, and especially after the sort of abrogation of Article 370, when I spoke up to say that communication blockades are a queer issue and that queer people need to speak up against a communication blockade. In fact, there were some incredible people, Kashmiris, who ended up coming for Pride. And what I want to imagine queerness as, and queerness as translation as, is how do we sort of build solidarities in a very crude way, if I may say so, that you scratch my back and I scratch yours. Because electoral math-wise, right, I've been helping a few people think of platforms to get elected. I have to create a lowest common denominator where I stand up for different communities who will then vote for me. In a similar way as a community, can we build allyships in the corporate world with other social movements, with other sort of spaces, without necessarily saying that those movements are our movement, but rather saying that this is a sort of standing up against discrimination or lack of equality across the board that we will contribute to. It might have potentials to do something different. And I say this again, as somebody who's been a student recently, as somebody who's sort of fired with a optimism that this is possible, that wanes a little later on. So I realize that's where I come from. But I think there is where I want to keep that point, if anyone wants to add to that. But I want to quickly start taking questions as well.
One thing, Anish, I think the issue here is not that we are moving on from a rights-based discourse to another discourse, right? I don't think these are mutually exclusive discussions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, right. So rights-based discourse is the most likely, you may like it or not, the one to get you results. Right? If you want to actually improve people's lives, you will have to use a rights-based discourse. That doesn't mean that there is no space for an idea of queerness as resistance, because that speaks to society. That speaks to literature, that speaks to idea, that speaks to people who will then go on to shape society. Part of the society are judges who will, so it's a kind of a symbiotic relationship, I think. When you have a rights-based discourse speaking to people who are going to enforce those rights, they will inevitably get influenced by the acts of resistance done by people on the street. So I think we shouldn't say we'll move on from one to the other. I think the two have to exist in tandem. And to say one is superior to the other, well, yes, in certain spheres it is. So in the court of law, a right is more important. But if I just go and start shouting about my rights in, as Madhavi said, in a Shaheen Bagh or some other place, it won't have the same emotional connect with the people, and it wouldn't cause you to see the commonalities of your deprivation, I think. So there you abandon your talk of rights and you talk of something else. It doesn't mean rights don't exist. They do. You just talk of something which is probably going to work better.
Well, maybe I'm just impatient. Not maybe, I am impatient. But to me, for instance, I do think there are other ways, right? I do think there are other ways. For instance, and I think this was the biggest low point in, for instance, queer activism in the United States, that all the heft that they had built up over the years, to my mind, was squandered on getting the marriage bill passed. And for me, that was an absolute waste, because why not? And this is a legitimate question. Why not put your entire might behind saying marriage must not be the way in which people get to have rights to inheritance, rights to hospital visits, rights to all these things? Why not separate those rights from marriage? And that is equally and as valid a question to be asked in a court of law. But nobody will do that because you're all much too wedded to the language of give me my right. And it's like, well, then what happens to all the illegal immigrants? You know, they are not going to get the marriage rights that you are going to get for immigration or whatever it is. Why not say once and for all, let's uncouple rights from marriage? Let's sort of say marriage is its own thing and rights are their own thing. That is a very valid legal battle to fight. None of you has done that. None of us has done that. And so I don't buy the idea that, of course, this will take place in the courtroom. I don't think so. I think there can be languages that are spoken that are similar. And frankly, taking down marriage, I think should be high up there on everyone's priority.
I want to actually ask a question that builds upon this a little bit. Is Lasya asked in the 2018 377 judgment, Indu Malhotra's history was an apology to the LGBT community. Apologies don't undo years of discrimination. Can and will there be a time when court judgments add ways forward while adding such social commentary, then retrospect mistakes? Saurabh, you want to take that?
I can. I think that was a bit of a flourish of a judge who felt deeply moved by what she had seen, right? So when she says history owes an apology, answer yes. Can apologies undo historical wrongs? To some extent they can. They can put a balm on all that had happened. Is that sufficient though? No, that obviously it's not sufficient. We need to move on. We need to build on, again, I'm talking from legal strategy, right? We need to build on that which the 377 judgment gave us. I think Madhavi is right to focus exclusively on gay marriage would be an error. Tactically, maybe it may not be an opportune time to move it. But there I sort of disagree with Madhavi about gay marriage in the Indian context. Nothing is more important for a mother or a father to say, mere bacche ki shaadi ho gayi, right? I think it has an emotive impact, the idea of marriage. And to say that, you know, let's decouple rights and marriage, that's a great idea if only it were possible, for the simple reason, we do away with the concept of marriage, we would nevertheless still be left behind with a core of some sort of companionship, which would be a relationship akin to marriage, right? So then would that require certain rights and recognitions? Yes, we require the courts to recognize that. So what I'm saying is, okay, you don't have marriage, but you can have the idea of a civil partnership, where you have a secular idea of two people getting together. We can say, okay, let's get away with that as well. And let's do away with that core as well. But then what happens about, say, if two people are together and they want to get an insurance policy together? Are we going to allow any two people to get insurance policies together? Obviously not, because that becomes a contract of gambling. What I mean by that is I would quickly go and get a contract for insurance over someone I know is ill, and I may not be related to them at all. When they die, I get the money, right? So the law doesn't permit you to get insurance for just anybody. You must have an emotional connect. So then the law would recognize it. What I'm saying is human relationships are complex, and inevitably two people will come together. Now it might be at the one end of the spectrum, the idea of marriage with all its religious connotations, or the idea of just two people living together with a bare modicum of rights, which are common to all. The idea of reaching for the maximum is that if the LGBT community gets it, the queer community gets it, we can build an argument to get the maximum number of rights for everybody. I think Madhavi is scared of the fact, rightly so, that what about those who get left behind? We mustn't forget those who get left behind. We must try to move them as well. And the way I feel we move ahead is to push ahead, and then make sure the people who have been left behind, we fight for them as well. We fight for everybody. There's no limit to empathy. There's not a lock, stock, and barrel, and then it's closed, right? It's hopefully we have enough to fight for everybody. But moving ahead, we have many, many, many battles. And gay marriage, I think, to some extent is a distraction. It's important. It's a signaling purpose. But I think the more important thing to do is a proper anti-discrimination law, which is needed not just by the queer community. Every disenfranchised minority, or indeed even the majority, i.e. women, need a proper, comprehensive, non-discrimination law. That's the need of the hour for me.
That's right.
Yeah, I want to build off what Saurabh and Madhavi said earlier. And queerness can also be beyond slipperiness, right? Queerness is, and this is, I mean, I'm just elaborating or thinking around what Madhavi said of resistance. And one way of resisting is also to resist having absolute or fundamental positions, and saying that, you know, I'm resisting the urge to say I want either this or this. Why can I not want both? Or why can I not want one thing in a certain context? And also, why can I not argue for one thing in a certain context and one thing in another? So if you ask me for my personal beliefs, if you ask me my values, if you ask me where I stand for, it would lean very much towards queerness as liberation, queerness as as a rethinking the norm, and creating, you know, new possibilities. In fact, the original title of Queeristan was Other Worlds Are Possible. But then since one also lives in the present world, one can also think of queerness as a certain kind of performativity which one does to get what one wants. So in my case, I'm very slippery in my mind, and even in my mind, and even in, you know, so in a corporate setting, I know what my limitations are. So I will try my best within that setting to get as much as I can get. Again, now it's a horrible tightrope to walk on, because you're always kind of disappointing someone else or yourself. But you know, when change happens, it's not sexy revolution. It's often people doing this laborious, time-consuming, year-long tightrope walking in which almost everyone at the end of it is unhappy. But I also want to make space within queerness for that kind of struggle. You know, it's not always these grand gestures. It's often this back and forth. So, and I want you, Anish, to recognize that.
Absolutely. Sorry, I'm going to quickly go on to two more questions because we have a lot of them that are open right now. What do you think about the seclusion of LGBTQI+ people under the pretext of inclusion, like the creation of the Rainbow Metro Station where trans people will work, or calling them she-men? And a related question, as a non-trans person, what is it that I could do for the group? Because I wanted to look at the educational and employment challenges faced by the community, but there isn't much research that is done. Could you elaborate on these challenges and what could be the 3 areas that need to be worked on with regards to the trans community? Now, we don't have trans representation on this panel, but we can sort of address that in general.
Parmesh, you should probably take
Yes.
this, yes?
So work with the community. I mean, it's as simple as that. There are so many incredible organizations, you know, within our country that are run by trans people, with trans people. You know, if you want to give, you know, as I said earlier, you want to give employment, or you want to work within the employment space, because I actually believe that that's fundamental. You can work with so many NGOs on the ground, whether it's Solidarity Foundation in Bangalore, whether it's, you know, there are trans consulting companies that are like Periphery, which only place trans candidates. And this is everyone from white collar to blue collar. Because of you know, structural discrimination, trans people might often not always be as highly educated, because if you look at the statistics, so many trans people drop out after 10th, after 12th, and so on. But which means that perhaps you can work with organizations like Sodexo or JLL, etc., and create a range of jobs. So a lot of experiments which are happening out there are this mix of mixing skill building, skills training with employment. So you can work in that. Of course, there are super qualified trans people who are, you know, very visible icons, whether it's a Zainab at KPMG or in politics with Apsara and Disha and so on, which are visible role models. But a lot of people in this case, if you're working on trans, would need a mix of, you know, of skill building and then jobs. So, I mean, there's a lot. There's actually a manifesto that we wrote, which is on the Culture Lab website. You can actually download it. It's about 100 pages long, and it makes a very clear case for why trans employment, how you can, you know, all the steps you can take, and, you know, who you can contact. So, but anyone who's asking what can we do, just please look a lot of the good projects over the past few years have been resource building. So if you go to List, which Anish co-founded, and you want, queer mental health counselors, there are about 100 people listed on that website city-wise, right? Likewise, there are so many resources that if you find online, which have people you can work with, COVID relief efforts that you can give to, and so on, that are community run. So if anyone wants to know what you can do, just message us, after this, and we will direct you to those. But don't think that there is nothing out there. There's a lot that's happening. You just have to give your time or give your money. And if you don't have either of those, give your attention by amplifying, sharing, and so on.
Does anybody else want to add on to that? Perhaps onto the question about she-man, metro station, and inclusion as seclusion?
Well, I mean, that's such a huge question, right? And I think this actually goes back a little bit, Anish, to what you were asking earlier about the post-colonial thing, about how, fighting homophobia is couched as a post-colonial endeavor, and to an extent it is. But the irony of saying we're fighting, say, Section 377, which is introduced by the British in India, which we have fought, luckily, successfully, finally. But the irony of having won that battle is that our language now continues to be colonial rather than post-colonial in any way. And so one of the arguments I keep making is that certainly before the British arrived, but I think continuing even to this day, obviously more in some parts of the country than in others, more in some discourses than in others, that queerness is actually a part of the fabric of everyday life of human beings, of families, of people, of offices, of parks, of everywhere. And so, one of the things is to give you a small example, and I've written about this as well. In the 2018 judgment, which was wonderful in so many ways, every single example that the judges quoted in their judgments about queerness, they called it sort of homosexuality, every single example was Western. There was not a single example that they could draw or drew from Indian cultures, literatures, philosophies, religions, histories, none whatsoever. And I fear that kind of historical amnesia affects all of us in one way or another. And so in many ways, I would say the language we are speaking now, whether it's of she-man or even LGBTQIA+, which is not a term actually I ever use, precisely for this reason, I feel we're just speaking a colonial language. We're speaking a language that is sort of, that has sprung up from, with very good reason, in the West to address certain issues that are endemic there. Now, this is not to say, oh, we are different from the West, not at all. I think that is absolutely a suicidal proposition. But it is to say there are other languages, to go back to your metaphor of translation. There are other languages that people here are actually much more familiar with, that they're familiar with, that we have a historical residue of, that we have a atavistic memory of, that we really should be tapping into. And this entire sort of trans communities in India are part and parcel of that history, are sort of so closely interwoven with what it means to be Indian, or what it means to be part of the Indic cultures. And so for me, it actually is, there's a price to be paid for saying we need visibility for trans people. And the price we are paying is that we are acquiescing to their invisibility in the first place. And for me, that the sort of visibility that they have historically had is what we should be reveling in and bringing back to the fore, rather than talking about visibility in this neoliberal, neo-colonial language that to me extracts a price from all of us that can sometimes be a bit high.
Just to jump in, Madhavi, and just to tell you an interesting anecdote about why there was no mention of the Indian tradition in the judgment. I was doing the case, we know it. We thought it would be a sensible move to actually cite a lot of material about ancient Hindu history, Indian history. We cited texts. But the moment we started citing them, there was sort of an uproar by the government, which had so far taken a neutral view on the matter. And there was they were deeply uncomfortable with us citing material which showed the existence, if not the prevalence, of queerness in ancient India. I think there was a problem. So I think possibly one of the reasons the judges skirted the issue was to avoid any further controversy. That could be. It's not as though the material was not put before court. It was, because to us it made sense tactically to show this material. But I think the courts avoided it because it is easier to frame a question as a colonial masters and us today than us dealing with our own history at some level.
Yeah, all I'll say is that kowtowing to this government is probably not a good idea, but that's a different panel, maybe.
Another debate, another time.
I hope this incident.
I'm really looking forward to the book now.
I can't wait to read your book. I hope you've written about this bit in your book.
There are juicy tidbits in there. Wait.
I did like you, Parmesh, for the book, because I think for the lay person as a kid watching that judgment, right? You know, there's a lot of things happening and a lot of things you're imagining, but you're not in the courtroom, so you don't know what's happening. But I think it actually relates very well to the questions that have been posed to you specifically, which is, I think, a frustration a lot of young people have, which is, having read some sections from the IPC and the bills, I realized that legal language is mostly passive, which gives it a very indifferent air, which makes me feel that our legal systems at times is more inclined to stick to the word of the law and justice becomes unimportant. Could you explain why legal language is framed in a way which makes it sound almost abstract? And just a smaller thing that, do you think that things like Shubhamangal Savdhan will help move these conversations beyond metros and also help sort of increase the imagination of what queer person is inside the courtroom?
Let me take the first part of that question, and the second part, I think Parmesh was nodding very heavily. I think he wants to answer that. In terms of the abstraction of the language, I think that is a factor of necessity. You read the language of the Constitution, it's incredibly dry, right? So when you have this idea of the right to life, the idea of citizenship, when you read these judgments of 377, all that the Article 21 says is that no person shall be deprived of his life or liberty without due process of law. It's very antiseptic sounding phraseology. But I think the reason for that is the way the constitutions are framed. They try to capture an idea without hijacking the future in a particular vision of what that means, right? The language is sought to be kept as open-ended as possible, because the idea is the Constitution will outlast its makers, and hopefully, see the American Constitution for over 200 years, it should be a gift that keeps on giving. Now, if we have very precise language, that which makes perfect sense just now to us will become absolutely irrelevant and of a dead letter, so to say, in 10, 20, 50, 100 years from now, right? So supposing we were sitting in 1950 and we were drawing a very precise Article 14, which is that all persons shall be equal before the law, right? The equality before the law provision. I dare say we would almost certainly, in the precision and the quest for precision, have excluded sexual orientation from the idea of equality, because that was not in anyone's frame of mind in 1950 that equality could envisage something like that. So we kept these very, very broad, abstract ideas to accommodate changing conceptions in the future. And that is why we have the most powerful court in the world, the Supreme Court, which is supposed to translate these abstract ideas embodied in the Constitution with the idea of the constitutional morality and adjust it to the needs of the day. So I'm afraid, I wish I could offer you a better solution as to a language which is more precise, and but that would actually be self-defeating, I think. Right.
I have a feeling Madhavi is going to disagree with me on Shubh Mangal and Ek Ladki Ko Dekha and all the other films, which is fine, because I often disagree with myself as well on this. So do I think that the films made a difference? Yes. And have they made a difference? Yes. It's what kind of difference, right? I mean, that's the thing. A lot of the films which have come about, and I write extensively about how Dostana is clearly problematic, but how, it opened up possibilities in ways. If you look at subtext or paratext of Dostana as well. And likewise with Shubh Mangal and Ek Ladki Ko Dekha, right? So to me, both these films, were they heteronormative? Hell, yes. Did they were tropes, right? They were all, I mean, it's the DDLJ trope I mean, it's a very clear formula and they've followed it, but they've either, they put two women or two men in either case. But do they work? Yes, because for a lot of people, for a lot of queer people as well, who got pleasure in seeing them, who used the films to come out to their parents, for a lot of queer people, I mean, there's a whole chapter in Queeristan in which I've kind of flipped the Karan Johar Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum tagline, right? Kabhi Khushi Kabhi Gum was, it's all about loving your parents. And I've kind of, my chapter is called, it's all about loving your children, your queer children in general, but I would hope especially queer children. And so much of our anxieties in India as queer people are predicated on, craving the acceptance of our parents. So I think, were they useful in helping a lot of people, have a glimpse of queer, of what it might mean to be queer in particular ways? Yes. Were they revolutionary in terms of the worlds they showed us and the possibilities? No. But I don't think they were meant to be those kind of films. So, yeah. But
I mean, just sort of, picking up on what Parmesh said, I don't think there's any problem with these films not being revolutionary. And let me just sort of say at the beginning that my eventual plan to watch Shubh Mangal was thwarted by the lockdown. So I still haven't seen it, but it took me that long to even sort of want to go and see it. I have no problems with these films not being revolutionary. In fact, I think why should they have an onus or bear the responsibility to be revolutionary? They should be able to be as good or bad as any other film. That's absolutely fine by me. What I sort of get annoyed by is sort of so-called film critics or so-called, movie buffs that are hailing these films as the first queer films in India, which is so patently untrue. But of course, it depends entirely on what lens, literally, that you're using to look at these films. I mean, for me, a film like Anand is more queer than anything that has ever been made since then. So again, it's to go back to that idea of amnesia, right? That people just simply don't know or are not, forget being aware of, don't care about anything that might be more expansive, that might sort of increase the horizon. So I don't mind these films, either being rah-rah films or not. I mean, I think that's an entirely unfair expectation. So my quirk with it, or my quibble with it, is from the other angle, that I don't think they are or should be expected to be doing, X, Y, Z. And I also think it's sad, I mean, talking about the cost one pays, because in the 60s and 70s and 80s, most gay men I know would have come out to themselves, if not to their parents, more easily after seeing Helen in a film than if they saw two men getting together, you see? And that kind of solidarity, that kind of cathexis, that kind of understanding is what we are so seriously in danger of losing now. And that's what makes me sad. So, that was my comment about the film. Just to go back briefly to what Saurabh was saying, and I completely agree about how constitutions have to be dry because they have to be, ideally, have to be expansive rather than the ability to shrink. They still have some extremely problematic terms in them. Most often, the term man and the pronoun he, which is always used everywhere. And again, I don't see why that can't be changed. But again, that's not a conversation anyone seems to want to have. I will say, though, to this person who asked this question and who obviously wants juicy masala things, which is why it's talking about movies, the judgments are not dry at all. Judgments are juicy, racy, horrible many of the times, wonderful some of the times. And so if you want your masala, watch 70s movies and read judgments. Don't read the Constitution or watch Shubh Mangal Zyada Saavdhan.
I'd say read both. Read the Constitution. The problem in our country is not that people know too much of the Constitution. The problem is people know too little.
Yeah, absolutely.
Start with reading the Constitution. It's a simple text. It'll bore you, but read it.
I want to end on this very lovely note. We have around 5 minutes left. I want to agree with Parmesh that my guilty pleasure has always been Ek Ladki Ko Dekha, because growing up, Jab We Met was my favorite movie. And I was like, here's a queer story with the same shitty plotline where starting the movie, I know what's going to happen in the end. And I want to go exactly for that. So I think if people were coming out with sort of Helen in the 60s, I think most of us came out with Sonam Kapoor also in the 2000s. But I want to end with this sort of idea of slipperiness. And I want to draw upon what Parmesh said, that all of us sort of have an ideological posturing that we are invested in. I know I've pushed a lot of you today towards very much defending certain ideological posturings, but it's resulted in some fantastic conversations. So thank you for that. I want to know how we can move forward in this way, because that's a lot of the crux of the question, that all this is great in theory. How do we take it forward in practice? And for me, that's been in the political sphere, finding whoever's queer friendly and going up to Supriya Sule and being like, listen, Supriya, fantastic, love you so much. Get an LGBTQIA+ helpline in Maharashtra. Get the transgender welfare board formed. Let's do something against conversion therapy. So in our own ways, how can we sort of keep our sort of ideological impetuses with us and make deals with the devil, or sort of push things further in a certain way that allow for the translation of theory into practice?
Formula. So I'll give you a formula from the book which is coming out first. So I use the term Jugaad resistance to talk about the work I do. And, you know, resistance is easy, and, you know, combining Jugaad with resistance. I mean, I think of my work through this lens of I'm performing Jugaad resistance. And Jugaad resistance in my mind equals infiltration plus cultural acupuncture. So that's my formula, which means, you know, how do we bring about these things is you resist all the time in multiple ways, but really cleverly. I've chosen to resist by infiltrating the system, but of course, any position, you can resist from any position that you have, you know, in the courtroom, out of the courtroom, within activism, within academia, within business, within NGOs, within homes, families, and your own self, I would say, in your own mind, right? And you, I mean, I've chosen to infiltrate, and I work with pressure points, right? Acupuncture is because you can, I mean, there's a whole world you can change. What's been useful to me is find out what point when I press can bring about the most impact, and based on my background, position in the world, access I have, and so on. So that's my formula. But I would say whatever we do, let's make sure that we use our position to speak for those you know, who may not be able to speak, to amplify voices that we may, you know, that may not be able to be amplified. So, yeah.
I just want to sort of pick up on something that actually we've all talked about already, which is that I think at a fundamental level, we might need to separate. I'm using these words within quote marks because they're problematic words. We might need to separate personal decisions or personal lifestyles from political decisions or political lifestyles or positions. And I say that I hope I can be heard to be saying that in the most capacious way possible, which is just to go back, Anish, to that first question that you read out from an audience member when she said, or he said, you know, I am not trans, but how do I help trans people? And I think we need to get to a point where the I am X or I am not X is almost irrelevant to being able to do X, to being able to sort of speak for what one considers correct, to be able to sort of reach a hand out to everyone who needs it. And I do think, and especially in a country like India, every one of us has to sign pacts with the devil almost on a daily basis. And we do that, you know, across the board, little things, big things, whatever they are. But even if we have to do that to ensure survival in some way, shape or form, I really hope that will not allow us to take our conscience hostage and our political activity hostage, and that we can continue to act no matter what deals with the devil we've had to sign. And so to that extent, the personal should not hold us back. If the personal is perfectly in sync with the political and allows us to expand, terrific. But for most of us, that's not the case. And if that's not the case, Instead of allowing that to hold us back, let's sort of say, I'm going to consider and realize that these two things are always going to be happening simultaneously. I don't want to give up my commitment to the one, even as I might have to let go of the other.
I think that's absolutely true, Madhavi. I think it's important also, therefore, not to be quick to judge someone else for the decisions they've taken. I think that's part of the problem with the queer community, is that we are very, very quick to judge. I think we have people of very strong opinions, and we label very easily and then expect certain things, and then we get agitated, etc. So we need a unity, actually. That's something I think is sorely, sorely lacking. We do not have, even today, something akin to a lambda legal, which is one NGO which will make sure that all litigation in relation to matters of the queer community are handled by one person. No, we have a fracturing, and we have multiple of competing people fighting with their little fiefdoms. It's a bit silly, but the change will therefore come by unity. But another thing I think very, very important is visibility. I think we think in this group, we're all educated people. We've been closely associated with the queer movement, and we think therefore change has already happened so dramatically. I don't think it has. We're nowhere near the kind of change we need to do. And we're nowhere, not that far away from 1970, 1980 in the villages, huh? Let's be very clear, or even in cities. I mean, probably more in the cities than in the villages. We need a much greater visibility of LGBTQ causes, of the queer causes, whatever terminology you like to use. We need to be seen. We need role models, both within the community, and we need people who are straight allies to stand up. It's not enough to have a couple of movie stars here or there stand up and say something. It's not enough for a company here or there in June to make some statement once in a while. We need people, big names, to come up and stand up for that which is right, not just for the queer community, but for, of course, many other causes. But since we're discussing this just now, yes, you need to come up and be counted. We need someone like Sachin Tendulkar. Why can he not make the right statement? Why can't Amitabh Bachchan or the Khans say something about this? Why not? I just don't understand this, if it's the right thing. So we need that, actually. And I think something like that will change hearts and minds more quickly than any amount of electoral organization or politicking that we can do. You know, if tomorrow Sachin Tendulkar stands up and says that I stand with a queer movement, more hearts will be changed than any other way I can think of. We are that country. That's us.
You know, how many people told me in the course of researching the book, especially younger queers, that one Satyamev Jayate episode, which Amir anchored, so many people said that was the moment, especially say Anish, your generation, that was the moment we got confidence about who we are, and either they told their parents or they didn't. But you know, Saurabh, you're absolutely right? That kind of mainstream acceptance will there's so much more than even quotes, no?
Yeah. And just one more thing. I'm surprised how Madhavi thinks that people in the 60s knew about Helen, as she speaks as though she knows of it in person. Just putting it out there.
I look younger than I am, huh? So.
Given we're contemporaries, Madhavi.
No, you're exactly the same age. You know whereof I speak.
Thank you, everybody, for a fantastic conversation. I think what has come out of this is that we need to have more conversations, both within the community and outside the community. This has allowed us to have a wonderful space. Hopefully, after the COVID-19 lockdown is over, we'll all be able to get together and spend hours, not just an hour, discussing these things and grappling at its end. Thank you so much to everyone at Belong for this lovely panel. I have had a phenomenal time today.